Hi everyone, and welcome on another one of our virtual Yellowstone tours. As you just saw, we're at Biscuit Basin, and that is the bridge over the Firehole River. Heading off to the right, the Firehole River flows past the Midway Geyser Basin and then the Lower Geyser Basin, and to the left it is coming out of the Upper Geyser Basin, which is where Old Faithful is, and you can just about see some steam in the background. On the day that I was filming this video, it was so windy that you couldn't even hear my narration. So I deleted the audio so you wouldn't be disturbed by the noise, and I'm now doing a separate voiceover. Having said that, we do have another Biscuit Basin virtual tour in our Yellowstone channel, and you may like to take a look at that as well. To give you an idea of where we are, if you take a look to the left and behind us, you can see the Artemisia trailhead. That leads from the Grand Loop Road all the way up to just next to Morning Glory, and to the right of that was the Daisy Geyser trailhead. I suggest that you take a look at a park map, which you can see at yellowstonetours.net/map. That's yellowstonetours.net/map, and I'm going to drop in a copy of the map right here. You will see that Biscuit Basin is a little to the south of the Midway Geyser Basin. It's also about 3 miles to the north of the Upper Geyser Basin. On our right is Black Opal Pool, and just next to it, the blue pool on our left, is Black Diamond Pool. Black Opal always looks a little milky to me when you compare it to Black Diamond. I mentioned earlier that there are 3 main geyser basins in this part of Yellowstone. You have the Lower Geyser Basin, the Midway Geyser Basin, and the Upper Geyser Basin. But there are also 2 other really beautiful geyser basins, and isn't that a pretty sight as well, with Black Diamond Pool in the foreground and the Firehole River in the background. There are also 2 other geyser basins in this area which are well worth a visit. One of them is Biscuit Basin, which is where we are at the moment, and the other one is Black Sand Basin, which, traveling between Biscuit Basin and the Old Faithful area, is literally just before the turnoff to Old Faithful and the Upper Geyser Basin area. As we look around, we see a mixture of bacteria mats and sinter and dead trees. Now, those dead trees that you saw off to the left in the background there were not killed by a fire, but they were killed by the sinter, which is what you see to the right of us. Those of you who've watched several of these videos will know that sinter is one of the minerals that is brought up from underground when a geyser erupts. So wherever you see a pale area, you know that there either was or still is a thermal feature there. Now have a look just to our right. This to me is one of the most beautiful examples of bacteria mats in the entire park, and I'll tell you more about bacteria mats a little later in this video. That's an area obviously where there's a lot of sinter, but then what we saw a moment ago, that very blue pool to our right, was sapphire pool. That sapphire pool over there. Look how beautifully clear, transparent, and how blue it is with that steam coming off it. Before 1959, elements of Sapphire Pool are what gave Biscuit Basin its name. There used to be little biscuit-like deposits surrounding the edges of Sapphire Pool, and in 1959 there was a gigantic earthquake. It was called the Hebden Lake earthquake, and Hebden Lake is a little outside Yellowstone, a little to the west, and when the Hebden Lake earthquake occurred, it affected the plumbing, the underground pipes, if you like, of so many geysers in Yellowstone. But what it also did was it caused Sapphire Pool to become a geyser and to erupt. Sapphire Pool used to have minor eruptions, but about a month after the Hebgen Lake earthquake, Sapphire began erupting to a much, much greater height, up to about 125 feet and almost as wide. And what happened when it did that was that it basically blew away all the biscuit-like deposits. So the name Biscuit Basin isn't really appropriate anymore, because we don't see those biscuits surrounding Sapphire Pool anymore. The Hebgen Lake earthquake I mentioned affected more, and this over here shows us why you should always stay on the boardwalks. The ground off the boardwalks can be really, really thin. It can be as little as 1/4 of an inch thick, and it's very easy when you step off to go plunging through the ground into the boiling hot water below, and to either get scalded and injure yourself very badly, or to actually burn to death. I mentioned the Hebgen Lake earthquake affected a lot of Yellowstone's hot springs and geysers. Nearly 300 geysers erupted shortly after the Hebgen Lake earthquake, and more than 150 of those had no previous record of ever erupting before. Having said that, as so often happens, the earthquake also affected the plumbing of various other geysers in a negative way, and they stopped erupting altogether. We can see here once again just how thin the ground is, and why you want to stay on the boardwalk system. Once again, we can see the thin ground and the center all over the geyser basin, and you can see why I mentioned to you, stay on the trails. You wouldn't like to go plummeting off into one of those, and I zoom up to show you just how thin it actually is. In a moment, we're going to be looking to the left, and that trail that we're going to be seeing in a moment runs off to something called West Geyser and eventually on to Summit Lake. And that's the trail to which I was referring over there. But more importantly, just past West Geyser, the trail runs into the Continental Divide trailhead. And the Continental Divide Trail, excuse me, not the Continental Divide Trailhead, but into the Continental Divide Trail. And that trail is an enormously long trail. It runs all the way from Mexico in the south to Canada in the north. I'll get back to that in a moment. I think the point I was trying to make, showing you these pools, is to show how in the center of the pool it is so blue, it is so hot in the center, and then as you get to the edges of the pool, so the temperatures cool down. At the very center of the pool, where it's so hot, very few organisms are able to survive. As I've mentioned in other of these videos, there are some that can survive. They are called thermophiles, or heat-loving bacteria. And as we look at those trees, it reminds me that I've often said that it would be a great idea if somebody were to do a book on the dead trees of Yellowstone. The shapes are really amazing. But I was talking about how as the water cools as it runs off the center of a thermal feature like a hot spring, so the temperatures get cooler and more thermophiles, more and more bacteria are able to survive in the areas away from the center of the hot spring. And this is why you'll generally find that with a healthy hot spring, The center is really very, very blue, and as you get to the edges, you get all the other colors, the yellows, the oranges, the greens, and the reds. Probably the best known example of that is Grand Prismatic Spring, which you'll find at the Midway Geyser Basin. Grand Prismatic is really an iconic site. It's one of Yellowstone's best loved features, and certainly one of its most photographed features. And you can see a lot more of that in two of our virtual Yellowstone tours. One of them is the Midway Geyser Basin tour, and the other one is the virtual Yellowstone tour excursion diversion, which we take to the overlook of Grand Prismatic Spring, which you may like to consider doing. I was talking about the Continental Divide trail being a really long trail, and it starts in Mexico and ends in Canada. And as you saw, it makes its way through Yellowstone National Park. And because of the amount of snow, and I'm sorry about that little jump, my device started overheating and shut down, and I had to start filming this section of the virtual Yellowstone tour again. But I was telling you about the amount of snow that we get in Yellowstone, and so people who do the Continental Divide Trail generally like to come through the Yellowstone area probably mid-spring into the summer, because that's when you're unlikely to run into as much snow, if any snow, and that's Sapphire Pool again, and you don't have to wade your way through feet of snow. We also operate Yellowstone Taxi, and that's a big plug, and we'll get calls from people who are on the Continental Divide Trail, and they will have reached the area about 10 miles to the west of West Yellowstone, where the Continental Divide Trail crosses US Highway 20. And in the background there, I'm pointing towards Daisy Geyser and then coming back towards where Artemisia Geyser is. This is what I mean by bacteria mats. And I mentioned earlier that Biscuit Basin has some of the best examples of bacteria mats in the entire park. Once again, as the water cools down, as it flows off the hot spring, so more and more organisms are able to survive there. And I think I take a shot here back towards the geyser. Yes, fortunately I do. And you can see what I mean by the marvelous colors with the really, really blue sapphire pool in the background. I mentioned people who are on the Continental Divide Trail, hiking the Continental Divide Trail, and they'll come out close to West Yellowstone, and they will have sent supplies ahead to the local post office so they can pick them up, and we'll get a call from people saying, hey, I've just come out on the Continental Divide Trail, can you please send a taxi to go pick us up? And some of the stories that they have to tell are really amazing, especially as they came through Yellowstone. This area over here, coming up on the right, often reminds me of coral that you may find in an ocean. It looks just like that. Anyway, I was saying that we'll get calls from these people and take them back into West Yellowstone, where they'll spend a few nights. Coming up on the left again, we passed Black Diamond Pool a little earlier, and then once again we'll be going past Black Opal Pool as well on our way back to the Grand Loop Road. On the right again is an area of Sinter, which I've mentioned several times, and in the background we just saw it on the right, was the Artemisia Geyser trailhead, which I mentioned to you. You'll find, if you do ever pay a visit to Yellowstone, that there are thermal features all over the place. You'll see hot springs and geysers in these fields. It's not only at the main geyser basins that you're going to come across all the various thermal features. And there is actually a trail from Daisy Geyser trailhead off the Grand Loop, which I mentioned to you, not only towards Daisy Geyser, but also heading off in the direction of Biscuit Basin, which is where we are at the moment. I'm afraid that once again, all too soon, I have come to the end of another one of our virtual Yellowstone tours. This was Biscuit Basin. Please remember there is another version of this tour where you have a live narration as opposed to this voiceover because of the wind. If you enjoy our virtual Yellowstone tours, please consider giving us a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel. Otherwise, see you in Yellowstone.